I'm Andy Schmuckler. I'm a guy who comes on every Monday at 11 and Thursday at 11, calling that regular appearance a man on a mission. Um, I introduced, when I did introduce on Daily Kos, um, my integrative vision of the story and situation of our species. Um, I called it a big picture view that might help human civilization survive. But I called it an integrative vision because it provides several different dimensions of ideas and it also um, ties them together. And I've got a venue where I am thinking of delivering a 4 speech talk series. And it comes to me that I've got 4 main ideas that form this integrative vision. The first one has to do with why civilization has developed the way it has, focusing on the implications of a creature taking the step, which had never been taken before on this planet, of inventing its own way of life and thereby extricating itself from the niche in which it had evolved biologically out of a biological evolutionary process that had been going on for 3.5 billion years. I say that if you look at that situation, the meaning of that unprecedented step, I call it the fateful step. You can derive something really important. In 1970, that's what came to me. It changed the whole course of my life. And that book back there, The Parable of the Tribes, The Problem of Power and Social Evolution, was the result of that 14 years later. It's the University of California Press, but it's still in print from the SUNY Press. That came out a long time ago. There's a story to be told, and we'll get to that maybe. The second idea is to observe that out of that unprecedented step and the unprecedented situation that step creates, there inevitably emerges a dynamic, a systemic force that mandates that the human world will get broken, and that brokenness will move through the human world over the generations in shape-shifting ways. There emerges, simply because of taking the step onto this path of civilization, a force of brokenness that consistently works to make things worse in the human world. And you see it by tracing causes and effects. The causes of what's broken are other broken things. And the consequences of what's broken are other broken things. That gives you a force that you can see in the same way as you watch things unfold over time. In the same way as you can see the wind and the swaying of the trees and the flapping of the clothes on the line. In fact, I would say that this definition, a coherent force that consistently makes the human world worse, is a very good definition of what has traditionally been called evil. That's the second idea. The third idea, again using the evolutionary perspective, is that evolution will have created within us certain experiential tendencies that can be deduced in an evolutionary way of thinking about things to be sources of life-serving guidance for us, because those tendencies wouldn't be there if it hadn't been advantageous for our ancestors to be coming into those genetically endowed tendencies. Because evidently, given that we've got those tendencies, those who had those tendencies survived more successfully than those who did not, hence life-serving. And one of those has got to do with value. We experience things in terms of better and worse, and that value actually brings value into the world. And so it's an important breakthrough if you're looking at things in a secular worldview, to realize that value is really quite real, important, and life-serving. It's built into us by a system that at one end is about biological evolution, and at another end it's got to do with our regarding certain experiences as positive and others as negative, which is built into us as one of the important strategies that life has come up with. When the game of life is evolutionarily is who gets to put their DNA into the future. All our ancestors succeeded. The fly that's buzzing around me, its ancestors succeeded. A lot of things didn't. That's how come you can get things really, really designed. That's how come the watch on the beach is not evidence of a watchmaker. One of the things that one understands in an evolutionary perspective is that when we took that step, we took a step out of a natural order that had been selected for its long-term viability. And that if you extricate yourself from that, you enter into an order. There's no order that regulates things in a fashion that assures that the system can prosper. I mean, in general, life creates systems that just naturally unfold in ways that work. I mean, but it's all been very dynamic and all that, but it's still trying to create a kind of perpetual motion machine. Even if ice ages come or an asteroid hits or whatever, whatever gets its DNA into the future will tend to be something eventually that's in some kind of harmonious relationship with everything else in the system. Things that evolve together tend to develop a synergistic relationship. That's why when the Chinese chestnut came out here to North America, it had 27 million years to develop a synergistic relationship, or at least a surviving together, whatever that word was, with this fungus. But it got imported to the United States, and here were there were massive chestnut trees that had not evolved with that fungus, and the wonderful chestnut forest was destroyed by what had not evolved with it. So the natural order, it means that things that are together over a long period of time will develop a way of interacting that's the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. That's why stepping out of that order is into disorder, and disorder of an anarchic sort, combined with civilization being little human societies that had broken out of various confines and continue to break out, and therefore there are a vast number of different cultural options. But in that disordered world of anarchy, the war of all against all inevitably emerges, and those cultural options, among the vast theoretically possible ways a human society might be, only those that are able to prevail in a war of all against all survive and spread. That's my big number one point. But then as that happens, you also get brokenness being transmitted from one form to another. The brokenness of war creates the brokenness of trauma, for example. Trauma could be defined as experience that the person cannot integrate into their total being. That failure of integration is both important to the clinical understanding of what happens to traumatized people, but it is also a representation that the trauma creates brokenness, and war creates trauma, and therefore, shape-shifting way, brokenness goes from the level of the societies interacting in destructive ways to the level of individuals having to incorporate those experiences into their being, and then being compelled to incorporate cultural demands that are imposed by societies that have been selected according to this, which cultural options conferred on a society the power it needed to survive a war of all against all and to end up on top instead of destroyed. The force of brokenness moving through the human world in shape-shifting ways is a way of envisioning essentially a force of evil. It works. There is a sense in which it works, not to personify it. This is purely inferring with logic, looking at evidence, a new disorder that's anarchy combined with vast cultural varieties for a selective process to choose among, results in the rise of the spirit of the gangster, because that's what prevails in a war of all against all. A force of evil can be seen if you trace these causes and effects. You can infer it. And it behaves like evil, as it's been understood, but not being in any kind of supernatural way. I've got a spiritual dimension that I say is real, important, and life-serving. But I'm looking at it in an evolutionary perspective, and I'm just inferring from the evidence. I'm not leaving the secular worldview. I confess that there's stuff about the spiritual dimension that I myself have experienced that I don't know how to understand. Like that time I saw evil while I was watching the Republican National Convention in 2004. I don't know how that happened, but it turned out to be it turned me on to something rather important that warrants being one of the ideas in this integrative vision, namely that with the rise of civilization, there emerges into the human world a force of evil. I didn't at first recognize it through that means of that I presented in a previous video. You can search for evil or something like that. Anyway, how you can see this shape-shifting thing moving through time and in the human world. I didn't immediately think that was the I actually discovered it by looking at the Republican Party as it has been emerging over the last 30 years, and in particular, I always say after I had that experience in 2004, because that experience was, like, oh, what was that? And then I explored how is there such a thing as a coherent force that does this? And I saw that the Republican Party was so consistent, increasingly consistent, as it became less and less the party of a generation of the first Bush, and more the party of a Newt Gingrich and a Tom DeLay and Karl Rove and Rupert Murdoch and Rush Limbaugh. Kind of a rogues gallery. I wouldn't put Reagan into a rogues gallery, but all the major Republican figures of our time fit in rather well to a rogues gallery. I saw that the Republican Party was consistently making things worse. Like at first, there were just a couple places where I could see maybe the Republicans being part of the scene had a beneficial outcome for the ultimate results of the political process. But they became fewer and fewer and further between. I had to admit that I was seeing something that was sort of like a pure case. If everything that ensues from whatever the field of forces at work in the Republican Party is gets to be, or even like 98% gets to be, show a destructive tendency, what can be inferred from that? What I inferred was that there must be a consistency about the direction. There must be a force that is consistently pushing in a certain direction. And if that direction is brokenness at every point, which is to say, making climate change crisis work, making race relations worse, making the defense of democracy worse, making the intactness of the Constitution worse, undermining everything you look at, widening the gap of inequality with that $2 trillion tax giveaway, which is all the Republicans really wanted to do in 2017, except for perhaps take health care coverage that every citizen of every other country gets away from millions of Americans, including a lot of their own supporters. Geez. So we've got a dynamic that emerges that's a destructive force that emerges because of the anarchy that the step onto civilization implies. That's the connecting those levels. And then we've got the dynamic of that we human beings are motivated by better and worse and by the nature of the spiritually transformative experiences that people are apparently prone to. We're motivated to try to move the world in a different direction from the one that force of brokenness entails. The force of brokenness makes things more broken. The force that comes from the way we want things to be, growing both out of our valuing of things that have been life-serving in our ancestral past and having spiritually transformative experiences that are widespread in the human world, cross-culturally throughout history, and that seem to have a major impact on people. And it must be there for some reason that evolution would explain that the people who had that tendency to go into this rather deep place where things seem especially meaningful and where things are not only valuable, but they're valuable to the nth degree, like sacred. And people have these kinds of experiences. You don't have to worry about whether what does that say about the nature of the cosmos. doesn't matter what it means in the nature of the cosmos. It's a dimension of human experience, and it's been part of the human experience, and it's there. Its being there is a testimony um, that it is a force for our survival, our fulfillment, the good. The survival plus fulfillment equals the good. That's the only way I can think of you would ever be meaningful to talk about good is that it's rooted in thriving is better than misery. That's where value comes in. You got a cosmos with nothing in it that feels anything, nothing in it to which anything matters, then nothing matters. Nothing can matter unless something matters to something. So I let myself go into something different than I'll just finish this up. Remind me. It really would be nice if you could. I want to talk about interesting and our experiential tendencies and such. Because the rise of a civilization creating creature both means there's going to be a creature whose nature has been shaped by a process that continually chooses what can get its DNA into the future over what cannot. I'm worse than Governor Perry. He's three departments and he couldn't remember the name of the Department of Education. I actually thought that was a bum rap. I mean, I don't have anything good to say about Perry, but the fact that he couldn't remember a list of three, it's something that would happen to a lot of people I know who are very on top of things in a general intelligence kind of a way. It's just, um, I didn't mind him getting shot up. We did end up with Trump. Anyway, where was I? I said, remind me, and I was on my way to do something. Yeah, the dynamic of, on the one hand, you take that step and you are a creature that has built into you value and access to a level of experience that apparently has been life-serving. And on the other side, you take that step and you're plunging into a kind of disorder that generates a selective process, which generates a force that operates like evil. And so we got the world that's getting developed because of the unleashing of brokenness. And then you got this creature that is carrying within it these yearnings or desires or tendencies to experience things in certain ways and to be moved to try to move the world in certain ways, whether it be, forming a friendship or, eating a meal or, whatever has been life-serving in the past is what it will tend to be moved toward. And if you look at the spiritual dimension of the history of civilization, you find a lot of messages that are obviously pretty life-serving. I mean, imagine a world in which people were doing unto others as they would have others do unto them. I mean, if that were universally observed, it would be, perfection. And then taking it even a step further, love thy neighbor as thyself. Taking it even further, it's not only not only being considerate, it's opening one's heart in a way, a real caring relationship. Imagine if all the human interactions in the world followed that. I think that's semi-typical of the spiritual truths that get brought back. When a fair proportion of people have some kind of a spiritually transformative experience. I know that I've had 4 spiritually transformative experiences. 2 of them were in the year 2004, which was made for a difficult transition, not a happy one, but it's the mission I'm on now. I can't explain all of them. The one that brought the idea that's at the core of the parable of the tribes, that I got my doctorate writing with distinction, writing a 1,600-page dissertation that got published rather nicely by the University of California Press, got a full-page review in the New York Times, got chosen as one of the men and women under 40 or that was not something I felt like I thought. I didn't feel like, oh, gee, I just had an insight. I don't, I call it a revelatory experience. And that was really important part of the experience, not to deny that. And it stayed with me for 2 or 3 years, I think. I felt it was important to maintain that. But I don't understand how it happened. I've had 3 others, and some of them they're not. Some of the one where I saw evil while I was watching the Republican convention. That was another experience that I couldn't explain. There was another that led to my writing about healing the wounds that drive us to war, which had to do with feelings of vulnerability and fear and taking in love and stuff like that. I feel like not in any great mystery about what that, how I got that. And there was another one, and there is a mystery buried in this one. I had an experience in the first part of 2004. Which you could find on my website, which is abetterhumanstory.org, under the title "Our Pathways into Deep Meaning." It was something which I experienced that because something in me got very whole, that had been less whole. I had other aspects of wholeness that sort of came with it. And I was looking into why that was. I mean, like, a crass example. I don't know if it's crass, but if you're in love, the flowers are more beautiful. The wholeness that comes from that open-heartedness leads to a whole variety of other forms of wholeness. In my case, it was, I was acting with a kind of strength and integrity that I hadn't had for a little while because I'd been sort of beaten down by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, as Hamlet calls them. But something had happened that brought out in me something that I sort of, remembered who I was or something like that. There's a story of the Buddha and a baby tiger that is brought up by goats that comes to my mind. But anyway, as I got into that greater degree of integrity, I was finding myself more sensitive to beauty and more open-hearted in my relationship with my beloved, and a whole a lot of things started coming together. And I was asking myself why, and was developing um, an integrative vision of the good, which I was calling mapping the sacred. And I put a lot of time into it. And I was delighted to be doing that because it was the first time that I mean, I was feeling like I needed to get into the good, the true, and the beautiful because I've spent my whole damn career looking at the evil, the good, the ugly, the good, the lie, and the ugly. The opposite of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And um, I was really delighted to be working on this mapping the sacred thing. I was swinging for fences, but I was swinging for a different kind of fence than anything having to do with the battle between good and evil. But then I saw, so that happened, I mean, it started emerging like in March of 2004. And, and then in early September, about a half year later, I saw this thing and saw that things that I held sacred, I was sort of sensitized in a sense to the difference between good and evil. The things that I felt were sacred were being jeopardized by this force that had taken over the right. So wrestled for a couple of months about, can I set this battle aside? And I'm an old enough man at this point. Well, I don't know how old was I guess I turned 60. But I was the oldest I'd ever been. I wrestled with it. Really hated. I asked for advice from some friends. Anyway, I've never been able to get back to that beautiful place where it was about wholeness and not about goodness. Right now I'm focused on the need to win a battle, which arises because there's such a powerful force of brokenness at work in the world, all the way from the American scene to the whole global scene. I wasn't happy to turn away from the good, the true, and the beautiful. But we do still have access to those values. We're engaged in it's a battle between good and evil, and it's not usually that way. I'm not saying that. I mean, I do say that there's been a battle at the center of the human world between two forces that might be considered good and evil, but they don't usually sort out. So, I mean, there's good and evil in the Democratic Party back in the 50s. There's good and evil in the Republican Party. And the battle was still going on, but it wasn't identified wholly with one being the embodiment of evil, which is what's happened over the last 30 years. And we do ordinarily, we'd be dealing with an ordinary conservative party that, we can see having played a reasonably acceptable role in American politics back when Everett Dirksen of Illinois was the Republican leader in the Senate. I mean, there was a mixture there. It's hard to find a mixture now. I mean, the Republicans are simply going to do what's wrong and refuse to do what's right. I mean, they're going to do that with the voting rights bill to make sure that Americans' voting rights aren't. They're going to do that with the aid to Ukraine, for crying out loud, just consistently. It's a pure case, and it's an extraordinary thing. And that means that our political times right now are extraordinary. Yes, the battle between good and evil goes on in all of us, and for things that are in a given family that are conducive to wholeness, but there are also things that are make things more broken. Most families have dynamics that you could talk about in terms of mixtures in that respect. But once in a while, the mixture changes into the pure case. I've studied 3 pure cases fairly intensively. Pure cases of some defined actor in the world that is really quite consistent in making things more broken. And the obvious choice that is one of them is the Nazi regime. I don't count, I know this is Mussolini, making the trains run on time, a real sign of wholeness, but the Nazi regime was a plenty pure enough embodiment of human evil for those times. People were absolutely appalled. This evil spirit that took over Germany and inflicted itself on the world. Give me a second here. Look for it. We are engaged in a kind of civil war too, and to some extent, it is a return of the force that drove us to civil war. I've got a couple of pieces out there on the web and on my website called "The Force That Drove Us to Civil War Is Back." But if you look at the third case that I feel like I know, how did America become so thoroughly in the grasp of a force of brokenness that we would have such a horrendous civil war? And I think that the answer is in the 1850s, you see, there's something taking over the South that's been ascendant even as the power of that region that had dominated the country, the slave part, because of the 4/5 rule, that power was gradually, it appeared, shifting. As the nation expanded west, the power was shifting more toward the north, particularly as waves of immigration, like from starving Ireland, had people choosing to live in the north rather than go to the south and have to compete against slave labor. So the South was losing power. And in the 1850s, there seemed to be a kind of a real force of brokenness that was taking hold in the South. The best book I know of on that subject is called The Impending Crisis. Not the one that was written before the Civil War, but the one that was written about the period before the Civil War. It's really very rich, and it's very reminiscent of what the Republican Party has become in the past 50 or 30 years. This tells us a lot about how patterns can move through the human world and constitute forces that can reconstitute themselves. This case has given us a pure case of a Republican Party that's behaving quite consistently as an agent of brokenness, just as the South consistently did in the period having to do. Maybe you'd start with the war against Mexico, and Texas being brought into the Union, and having to deal with whether or not to extend boundaries of the Missouri Compromise as the nation moved west. All these battles about bloody Kansas and things like that. It was all about slavery. And which reminds me about brokenness when you got people here, like in the Shenandoah Valley where I live, who believe obvious lies about the Civil War. It was all about slavery. It was all about maintaining a power arrangement in which a few white people would be very dominant politically and economically through a system in which black people are mere human livestock. And as the Irish immigration choosing the North indicates, competing with slave labor is not a good thing for the whites who are not the really, really rich plantation owners. Competing with slave labor means the slavery system was actually, as far as I can tell, the slavery system not only didn't benefit the people who didn't own slaves, it economically hurt them. The Irish immigrants were smart enough to know better off in the North rather than be one of these non-slave power whites. But just like in the Republican Party of this time, that force that drove us to civil war persuaded the mass of white people in the South to support the perpetuation of an economic system. And by the way, nobody was going to ban slavery where it already was. They are persuaded to support a slavery system that keeps themselves poor. And the best of my understanding about how they did this is very much like what we can see in the Republican base today. What they did was they made anybody questioning slavery's wonderfulness an insult, someone who has insulted the honor of the South. And you can see in the cornerstone speech of Stevens, a former senator, became vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stevens. He brags about the great moral principle of white supremacy. Doesn't use the words white supremacy. He just says that it's founded on that great principle. The white man is superior to the black, and that being the white man's slave is the natural position for the black to be. That's a famous speech that articulates a system that was all the whole thing was about, and was all everything was made about that in the 1850s. I mean, even where to build a continental railroad was held up because of sectional battles that were directly concerned with whether or not slavery's power would be able to expand as the nation was expanding and as power was shifting maybe somewhat to the north. I mean, we're talking about a slaveholding class that wasn't used to accommodating the needs of other people. Some people were their slaves. Some people were people that they could manipulate with lies, and the culture as a whole was something that they were in a position to shape. And one of the interesting things, in my view, is that the slave system actually generated its kind of person, because before the American Revolution, the degree of inequality of wealth and power in the Deep South was way greater than anything in the North. I don't think it was till the 19th century that that Yankee economy produced that kind of inequality. In the time of William Penn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was a substantial degree of equality, relatively speaking, compared to the big plantations that developed in the South, because slavery was the basis of the economy from early on. And that generated really inequality. And so early on, we get a slaveholding class that's not used to having to accommodate anybody. In fact, they're able to manipulate and exploit the people below them, because early on, they're setting up the society. It's the spirit of the gangster we've talked about before. Though these gangsters are also real gentlemen. Spirit of the gangster. What enables people who, in the rest of their lives, I'm talking about the people I live among, um, in the rest of their lives, they seem to have a pretty kindly spirit about them. Not all of them, but as neighbors, as people to do business with. Um, how is it that people, they talk a good talk in their churches, and often walk a good walk too. How is it that they don't see that what they're supporting is the opposite spirit? Here I am back to wanting to know how to reclaim the people in the Republican base. I really would like to have good people come back. Anyway, the healing of the world has to take place at a lot of levels. And at the center of our present drama is the election of 2024. That election is one of the showdowns in a fight between the force of fascism and the force of democracy, which boils down to a force of brokenness versus a force of wholeness, which equates basically to a battle between good and evil. These forces can be found and seen empirically. But there is sometimes in the world a battle that should be understood in terms of between good and evil is not something which is at the moment compatible with the secular worldview, at least as I've come to believe I've understand it to be, which is, there's no such thing as a battle between good and evil. I'm saying, yes, there is. You can derive these forces fairly strongly, watching the implications in an evolutionary perspective of what happens when a creature steps out of the the natural order and onto the path of civilization. There will emerge a battle between good and evil. And that's part of how we should understand what we're doing right now. Anyway, those are some of the main ideas. I enjoyed rambling. I hope that it was better than my being as systematic as I began planning to be.